When you think of the sounds of summer at Kings Island, one of the sounds that certainly comes to mind, at least for me, is the KI and Miami Valley Railroad. Hello, everyone. Alongside Ryan Sir, I'm Don Helbig, and this is Tower Topics.
Tower Topics is a podcast by Kings Island fans for Kings Island fans because that's who we are and that's who we care about. Let's kick this off by thanking our prestige members. I want to give a big shout out to Miss Mandy, 1983, Lil Mac, 21, Brian Hauser, 330T, Aaron Board, Jacob Fix, Damon Barnes, Dakota Cole, Eric Groud, Gibson Hills, Dustin Jackson, Songstress Miku, Medic 302, Eastern Coaster, Guys and Girls, Justin Y, Mike Garrett, Galaxy B-Boy, Greggy Rocks, Kayla La, T. Cleveland, and Tim Dwelly. Thank you guys so much for supporting Tower Topics at the highest level. That's the prestige level. If you want to be involved in Tower Topics, there's a link in the description. Members get early access to the videos, exclusive content, exclusive live streams, and some tiers and get some free stuff. So if you want to support Tower Topics in the best way possible, click that link in the description, starting at just $2.99 per month.
So, Ryan, as you know, I am a big fan of the KI and Miami Valley Railroad, one of my favorite rides, which makes me super excited to introduce our guest on this episode of Tower Topics. He was there from the beginning with the train when Kings Island opened in 1972. So let's welcome in Dennis Larrick.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right.
So tell us a little about yourself, Dennis.
Well, I got into the engineering business and worked for about 20 years cleaning up the air in factories, and then became a teacher and taught high school engineering for about 14 years at the end. I always loved trains. My dad got me a Lionel when I was 2 years old, like a 2-year-old needed a Lionel. I think he got it for himself.
Maybe.
And then I think when I was about 10 years old, they used to bribe me to go to my grandparents by going through Columbus. And we stumbled into a little amusement park there that had a little steam train about half the size of the one at Coney. And I fell in love with that and decided right then and there, someday I'm going to build one of those. And it only took me 30 years before I started.
So that's your origin story. That's how you originally fell in love with trains. Can you tell us a little bit more about your first experience when you saw that train and what you liked about it and what inspired you to be involved in trains?
Well, I think the smell of the coal, it was a coal burning engine, and just the fascination that it wasn't something you just turn a key and go. Steam engines are, a gasoline engine is a complex machine that all the automatic controls are there. Whereas a steam engine's a simple machine, but you are the automatic controls. You have to do all the fancy stuff. And it went back through the woods along Alum Creek there in Columbus, and it overlooked a junkyard at the far loop. So I figured, well, that may be the way miniature trains are supposed to be. Someday I'll have a place that has a junkyard so I can run the train past it. I don't know.
All right. So, Dennis, when you think about the Kings Island and Miami Valley Railroad, what do you hope people understand about it behind it's a park train?
Well, even though it's obviously been glorified and maybe a little bit cartoonish in the colors and things like that, it is a real steam engine. And there aren't many places you can go to see a steam engine today. So I'm very, very thankful that they've kept it there, and they've kept it at Cedar Point and a couple other parks around the country where you can go actually see one operating. It sort of gets to you after a while. Once you've been around them, they just become addictive to you. And I've gone all over the country looking at them.
All right. Now tell us about the first time you met Lou Brown running his own engine in Waynesville, Ohio. And what did you notice about him right away?
Well, first of all, my dad loved to take Sunday afternoon drives. So one day he said, let's take the family and just go down and see this amusement park they're building in Cincinnati. We drove up Columbia Road and we saw the Eiffel Tower halfway up. And of course, the main gate wasn't built yet, so we could see the buildings of International Street. But the main thing was there were 3 houses along Columbia Road, and right behind it, there was a railroad track. We couldn't see how big, but we could see the track. So I kind of got excited that someday I was going to come back and ride whatever they were going to have. And we were heading back home up US 42 through Waynesville. And I looked down into the woods next to what was Der Deutschler there. And I saw a little steam train. I yelled, steam train, and my dad about ran off the road because he worked on steam engines with my grandfather at one time. So we went down, we met Lou, and we met Dick Carmel, his sidekick. And Lou was just a hobbyist that just had a lot of fun. He had bought this thing out of Texas. It was called the Little Sunshine Special in Longview, Texas. and it ran a loop next to the Der Deutschler there. And the only thing I really remember about that day is that Lou overfired it and left some oil between the rails. My dad was stomping out the fire as it followed us around the track. So I thought, this is really cool. I'm going to come back next summer and help him work on this thing. So the following week, I got on the motorcycle and rode down to Waynesville. And I said, Mr. Brown, I'd love to help you with this thing next year. And he says, well, I'd love for you to do that, but I've already sold it to someone in Kentucky because I'm going to be running the railroad at this new amusement park. I said, oh, and I'm thinking Coney train size now. I wasn't thinking anything big. And I said, what would I have to do to get on the crew there? He gave me Bill Reed's name at Coney Island. I wrote to Bill, and Bill wrote back and told me about these trains that are going to be fired on what he called profane gas. And still, I was thinking it was just a little thing. So I didn't really know if it was going to work out for me, but Bill invited me to come down in December to Kings Island and look the thing over. So that's how it all got started.
Amazing. So you searched for Lou's engine for about 50 years. What kept you chasing it all that time?
I think it was just curiosity more than anything. It was one of my first inspirations to get into the hobby. And Lou was a great friend. He was a great mentor. And I just wanted to see what happened to it because I never found out what happened to it. It was sort of an accident how I found it. It was about 50 years I kept looking for it. He had told me what I thought he said Louisville. So I was always trying to chase down Louisville. And one day, just last fall, I was on a site about park trains, and someone had a post that said, this is my grandfather's train. We don't know anything about it. We don't know how to run it. Does anyone know anything about this? And there were a bunch of people trying to guess where it came from, and no one really had any real good ideas. And it was painted bright red on the front, so I didn't recognize it. Well, as it turns out, I was about ready to log off, and my mouse just happened to drift over the picture of the person that was doing the post, and it says, lives in Louisa, Kentucky. And I thought, Louisa, that's what he said. So I messaged them, and we got back and forth, and I said, have you heard of Lou Brown? And next thing, she emailed me a picture of the bill of sale. So they now have it. The grandson wants to run it. The sad part is the guy that bought it from Lou built a shed for it, put it in the shed, and then he died, and he never got to run it. So it's been sitting in that shed for 50 years now.
Well, walk us through the moment when you discovered it. I mean, you looked for it for 50 years. You were close to what city you were looking for, but no cigar. Yeah. So what was it like to actually finally stumble upon it, especially in such an accidental manner?
Well, that was just exciting. You know, I hope that someday I'll get down there to help them get it going. They just had a baby, so it's probably not going to happen soon. But one of these days, I'm going to get down there and help them get that thing fired up again for Lou.
All right, now talk about your Kings Island experience and how that gave you the confidence to build your own working 750-pound coal-burning steam locomotive from scratch.
Well, after I saw the one in Columbus as a kid, I said I'm going to build one. So I already knew that was going to happen. I didn't know when or how, but I was going to do it. But working on the engines at Kings Island gave me the impetus to actually get serious about it, since Lou obviously had an engine. Dick Carmel had worked with a few. Dick actually lived in California for a while, and he went over to, what was the animator's name over there that worked for Disney? And he had a full-size train in his backyard. He got to meet Disney, and he worked with a lot of the little ones. So there was inspiration all the way around to build my own engine.
And what was the hardest part to figure out without, really any kind of roadmap?
Well, I knew approximately what I wanted the engine to look like. It was an 1880s model, and I had to make drawings for it. And my plan was to take photographs and make my own engineering drawings, because you can't just scale down a full-size engine. The laws of physics don't change. A bubble in the boiler or a drip of water is always the same size. And if you were to scale an engine down to half size, the piston would be 1/4 of the area of the real thing, and the amount of steam in the cylinder would be 1/8 the amount of steam in the real thing. So you can't really scale an engine down. You have to redesign it. So I'd already planned that I was going to do that. Well, as it went on, I stumbled into a guy in California that collected old drawings, and he had a full set of 1879 Baldwin drawings for the engine that I wanted to build. And so, and it was a bunch of drawings. It was a ton of drawings. So I ordered everything he had, and I figured, okay, in a couple of months, I'll be able to draw these up. Well, it went 2-3 months. I never heard a thing from him. So finally, I gave up on him and started doing my own drawings off of whatever I could find. And I think I spent 8 months making those drawings. And then one day, the mailman brings me a big roll of drawings. No explanation, no apology, no nothing. So I looked him over and I said, this is far better than what I've got. And I trashed 8 months worth of work and started from scratch again. So that's how I got my engineering drawings for building it. And then when it came to fabrication time, I was working for a company that had a sister company that was in the metalworking business. And they had this $1 million Mazak laser cutter machine that could cut steel plate up to a 1/2 inch thick. My boss was always saying, I know I can't pay you what you really want to stay here, but I want you to stay. So I'm going to try and find you perks. And one day he came in and said, could you use that machine to build your train? I said, oh, yes. So I struck a deal where I learned to program it, and I was their backup programmer. And in return for doing that, they ran it on their lunch hour out of scrap material, and I made about 200 parts on that thing. So they got me going.
Yeah. So you've been a member of the Cinder Sniffers live steam club for 53 years. What's the community meant to you and your hobby?
Probably it's just a fundamental part of my life, like my church and my job. I've been with them long enough now that I've been secretary of the club for I don't know how many years now, and the friendships are there. And sometimes when life gets tough, we've got 3 beautiful rustic acres I can go out and camp out if I want to. And by the way, I didn't name the club. Most of the other clubs are like Northeast Ohio Live Steamers or Indiana Live Steamers. I didn't name the club. I don't know where we got Cinder Sniffers from.
It works.
It does. And you mentioned that the smell of the engine, the smell of the coal burning engine is something that attracted you initially, to circle back to that. And I think that for a lot of people, the attraction to like the engines at Dollywood and Cedar Point that actually burn coal, it has a smell that's like beautifully
pungent.
Dirty. Yeah. So it's not a good smell. It's not a bad smell, but it's a distinct smell, Right.
It's what you would have smelled in your own neighborhood 100 years ago because everyone burned coal in their house.
Exactly. So tell us a little bit more about building your train, like a little bit more behind the scenes. You mentioned that you couldn't just scale it down.
Right.
How long did it take you to build, and what kind of man hours were you looking at?
Well, I don't know how long it'll take to build because it isn't done yet. I've been on it 30 years now, and I still haven't finished. But it runs. It's been torn down for the last 5 years. And in 2020, during COVID, I tore it down to give it a rebuild, and then life got in the way. So I'm just now putting it back together and hope to run it this year.
So you visited the family in Pennsylvania who built the trains.
Mm-hmm.
So what stood out to you about their operation and their craftsmanship?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things is they never intended to do it. K.S. Williams had a metalworking company. He made like fence wire and pot scrubbers and things like that. And he was just a hobbyist, and he bought an engine from an amusement park down in the Carolinas somewhere as his own hobby engine. And then one day he decided, well, I'm going to take this thing to a steam show somewhere in Pennsylvania. I think it was over at Kinzer's. And instead of taking it the way it was in 1904 when it was built, he put a big old cab on it, big old smokestack and cowcatcher and an oversized headlight, and made it look like something out of the Wild West. And someone at that show looked at it and said, I'd like to have one of those. Can you build one for me? He says, well, I think I can. I think I got the skills. And so he did. And that was the beginning of a company that built 109 trains. And 20 of them were the size of Kings Island's trains. So it became a pretty good family operation until all of a sudden the steam went out of the theme park building business and there wasn't any more business anymore.
Right now, Dennis, you got to run the very first Crown Metal Products engine. It was actually a Cagney at their home. What do you remember about that particular day?
Just that it sort of felt like an honor to finally get to see the first one and get to run it. The family that owns it now, it's the grandson of the guy that founded the company and his kids. And they're just wonderful people. KS started the company, and then he died right before Kings Island's trains were delivered, and his son Bert took over. And towards the end, Bert was sort of getting tired of the business, I think. He had gone to another park, not Kings Island, and saw that they didn't maintain the trains very well. He says, I never want to see another one again. And right before he died, I think he died in August of 21, I think. They caught him actually throwing the archives and the pictures in the dumpster, and his son went out and grabbed them and hid them. So now that family is trying to put together the history of the company. Ken, the grandson of KS, and his wife, Cassandra, are just wonderful people. I love that day over there.
All right. Now, for people who don't realize it, what does it take to build a park railroad, the locomotives, the coaches, the track, maintenance, so it's guest ready every single day?
I would say money would be the first place to start. The Kings Island trains were not cheap. Those locomotives were $72,500 a piece back then, and that equates to over $1 million today. So they had 2 locomotives plus 12 coaches. I think they probably put about $700,000 into the whole ride. Maintaining it, you're going to have frost heave every winter, and you got to line up the track. And when you're running a loop like Kings Island, the train actually pushes the rails around the loop, and you have to come back and pull them back into place the next spring, which is a little bit of a maintenance hassle. The coaches have full Westinghouse brakes, which I can explain later, but they're a bit of maintenance. And then steam engines themselves, the real thing, spent about 50% of its time in the roundhouse. You have to do boiler washes, you have to tear down air pumps, you have to do the valve gear timing. You've got all kinds of manually lubricated bearings on them that wear. So steam engines are labor intensive. And I don't know what their schedule is at the park now, but it was for a while that they would tear down one engine, say this year, and then they'd have a buy year next year. And then the following year, they tear down the other engine. So each one got a 100% total tear down piece by piece every 4 years.
Yeah, a lot of work goes into it. So let's go back to 1972 and put that year into perspective. How small, when Kings Island opened, was it compared to today, especially when you remove the train and the picnic, area around it?
Well, to me, it looked huge. But when you compare it to what we have today, it was just a tiny little place. Disneyland opened with 69 acres for the park, minus the parking lot didn't count. It was 69 acres of park. And so did Kings Island. We were right around 69 acres. But at Disneyland, they ran the train around the park, so it was just this little narrow piece of land all the way around that the train consumed. At Kings Island, Ed McHale, the park manager, was a real fan of the train, and he was very much a fan of putting in the one at Coney Island. And so he wanted a lot of land for it, and he gave it 22 acres. If you're seeing the picture right now, the train consumed the blue part. That was 22 acres, and then the green part was another 8 acres for the picnic grounds. So you take those 20 acres off the 69, you got a little park that's only 40 acres, and I don't think Coney was much bigger than that. So it was kind of amazing how small Kings Island was today. And in the drawing, you can see the blue line sort of going out into space around the white part there. That's the size of the park today. So you can see the park was probably less than half the size it is today. It was a tiny little place.
Yeah, fascinating. So going back to the original track layout, what were some of the artifacts and scenes and stuff that people would go? Because for people like me, when I first heard the train, it was like the early 90s. So they already had the water park. So they kind of ruined the train experience as it was. I never saw it with live actors. I remember something with Native Americans and stuff. But can you talk about what people would see, especially back in 72 when it was a crown jewel of the park?
Well, when we started out, they saw nothing because it was a mud hole out there. March and April was horrible weather, and construction was really limited at that time. So we had a loudspeaker on the station platform, and they gave the conductors a spiel to tell the people standing and waiting for the train, this is what you'll see in a couple months if you come back. So that's what they saw in the beginning. They brought all the animation up from the Coney Island and Lake Como Railroad and pretty much duplicated what they did down there. We had a bear, then we had a wolf that howled at you, when we had deer, and then of course we had the Indians shooting at us, which today probably would be frowned upon a bit. So that lasted probably through June of that year. And then one day we're chugging up the hill and we see a couple guys coming out of the forest with fake rifles. And it turned out to be a couple of the guys that were working the 12-man canoes. And they were on break. They were bored. They wanted something to do. So they came over and robbed the train. And I don't know if they got in trouble for that, but live shows turned around and hired people to do it after that. So the live shows were interesting. It was somewhat vaudeville. We had a kid by the name of Mark who was wonderful at coming up with vaudeville type slapstick humor. Some of them were the ones that weren't planned were the best ones, like when they came running across the beaver dam and to chase the train and they fell on the rocks and tore their legs up. And we came back past the same scene on the way back and the passengers are pointing and saying, wow, that looks realistic. That's really cool. So, but then he used to do scenes like he would die on the side of the hill, but when you've got 6 cars worth of train, he had to stretch that for 2 or 3 minutes. And he would do all kinds of weird stuff on the side of the hill when he died. One time he brought in a load of sand, and when we started shooting at him, he'd hide his head in the sand, and just dumb stuff like that. So the first year it was just the Indians chasing us. The second year, they added a young lady, one of which they had 3 or 4 people that played Miss Jessica. One of them became Miss America later on, Susan. But the bandits would actually stop the train right before you got into the station and take Susan off the train and haul her into their cabin. And I could go into a lot more details on that, but I think that's so far from being politically correct today that people would probably be offended.
Yeah, you're talking about Susan Perkins, correct?
Yep. Susan was a great gal. Yeah. I would probably ask her out, except that she was dating the quarterback of Miami.
I think you should have gone for it. With all this train knowledge, there's no way that she wouldn't have dumped that quarterback from Miami for you. So there used to be a private picnic ground where Whitewater Canyon is today for the engineers. Can you tell us about that? And I've heard that there's a story about borrowing a picnic table that you would like to tell.
Well, it wasn't planned as a picnic ground. It was just handy next to the engine house. We looked at it one day and said, what if we could get someone to steal a picnic table out of the picnic grounds for us? Okay. So one of the maintenance guys grabbed a fork truck and brought it over, and we put it out there in the woods. And, of course, Lou was obligated to chew our butts for it. Mm. But later on, I caught him back there, and he said, yeah, this was a pretty good idea. So it worked out okay.
Yeah. And then Kenny Van Meter.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a big personality. That's a name I've always heard, never met the guy.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like working with him, especially like late nights, like the grad nights and stuff like that?
Kenny was actually, he didn't have a big personality. He was a big guy. He was probably taller than I was, but he was a very quiet person. He'd been a farmer all his life. I don't know how much education he had, but he was just a really nice guy to work with if you understood him. You know, he had one of those real dry senses of humor. You know, he used to say, well, those people down at the cartridge company, they just used to blow people up with great regularity. And on grad night, you know, he had his opinions about what teenagers looked like in the 1970s, let's say. And he says, those kids are freaks. And I said, Kenny, those people might be my friends. How can you say that? And he just looked at me and said, well, you're a freak too then. So he was just a nice guy to work with.
Right, now let's talk about Lou Brown. This is a guy that, when I talked with people that had been involved with the train for years, one of the things they would always say is that, he seemed to like you right away. So what do you think Lou saw in you, and what did you learn from him about leadership?
Well, I think dedication may be part of it, because I was a hard worker, and, the other guys, they'd go back to the engine house and sit down, and I was always the one up there polishing the brass. And I think the other thing is that Bill Reed originally told me he was going to hire me in December of 71. And then I called back in a month and they said they changed their mind. They were going strictly with the older guys. And I sort of fought to get that job and keep it. And I think Lou respected that a lot. Plus, I respected Lou's knowledge. I was always asking him questions. And he was just a very soft-spoken, but very firm and fun fun-loving, but fun-loving in a quiet way.
Now, back in those days, the train crew was known for keeping the engines spotless.
Yep.
How intense was that standard?
Oh, it was a voluntary standard. It wasn't impressed upon us, but we knew that Lou wanted them to look like that. Of course, they were brand new, so they looked great anyway. But I remember using a toothbrush to clean parts of it before they did the Brady Bunch shoot. And then, of course, they didn't use the footage. We would scrub down. Yeah, that's typical, right?
Right.
We would scrub down the engines almost every day. We had a schedule where, say on Monday, let's say the green one goes out from opening until dinner, and then the blue one goes out from lunch until closing. So that meant that the green one would be in the engine house Monday night and Tuesday morning, and then they would switch roles. So that's when we cleaned them up a lot. And for a while, Dick Carmel had made us a homemade steam cleaner so we could spray down the wheels and just really get them clean. We always covered after we polished the brass, we would wipe down the engines with kerosene and oil to make them shine. The smoke box and the stack, they got the heavy steam cylinder oil to make them black. So they were clean almost every day, and we were probably not supposed to be doing it because we had union painters, but we were always painting the engines ourselves and not telling anyone we were doing it. We had a little problem. They were originally Rust-Oleum paint, and Rust-Oleum does not like hot water. And every time you blew the whistle, the green engine had yellow stripes and the blue engine had orange stripes on it. So we were always cleaning that up. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of work keeping them looking nice.
Hey, it's job security. If every time you paint it makes it worse, then just keep painting, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So Kenny's engine had a cartoon number 12 on the headlight, and both engines had roadkill cartoons on the side that the public couldn't see. Why did you do that, and what did it mean to the train crew?
We were just a bunch of clowns. We were having fun. You know, I remember we ran over a possum and a turtle. So 19 had little cartoons of that on the side of the cab where, you know, keep in mind that the public couldn't see the left side back then. We only had one station. And then I made a cartoon of Kenny and put it up on the headlight with his name at one time. And then on number 12, as I recall, we ran over a snake that had managed to stretch itself over both rails. So we had a 3-piece snake on the side of that engine.
All right. Now you ended up in 2 original park postcards. One became the big trade show image that Crown used. How did you find out about that, and what was it like to see that later?
Well, I think later in the season, I went and saw a postcard on the rack, and I said, "Oh, that's the train. Wait a minute, who's that guy there?" And my attitude was someone had to be in them. You know, if it wasn't me, it was going to be someone else.
Sure.
So I got into 2 of the postcards, and it's kind of fun to open the internet and see people still posting pictures of those postcards.
Yeah, it makes you immortal in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it does.
So you were involved with Ticket to Ride, a book by Barry Hill, who's he's been associated with a couple of different shows that Don and I have done. Tell us about that project.
Well, Barry just contacted me last fall, about 6 months before the book was ready to be published, and just said, you know, would you be willing to help me? Would you be willing to do a little editing and look at what I've done? Because he'd seen me on the internet a lot on a lot of the chat sites. And so I started looking it over and, you know, corrected a few things and gave him some ideas and some other pictures. Don gave him a lot of pictures there. And so right before it went to press in the spring, I said, can I do one last look at it? And I wrote him about 5 pages of things to correct right before it went to press. It turned out spectacular. It is a spectacular book. And if you're interested in railroads, trains, amusement parks, it's one you should have.
Yeah, Barry Hill does good work. He's worked with John Keeter for Kings Islands. That's one of my favorite. I don't have, normally I have it within reach, but he does good work too. And especially because your stories have been fascinating. I imagine this book is just off the chain.
Yeah, he does a wonderful job.
That's right. Now the Kings Island trains, they're known as full scale, full size, narrow gauge. So you can you explain that, you know, narrow gauge,
there's a good drawing. There's a good drawing. Okay. Trains today, all your railroads today are 56.5-inch wide track from the inside edge of one rail to the inside edge of the other rail. But back in the 1870s and 80s, small towns didn't have the money to build a full-size railroad, but they could build a small one from their town to the nearest junction with a big railroad. So they would build these little trains that ran on 3-foot wide track. And that was popular for about 20 years because it was cheaper to build them. But they soon found out that transferring the freight from the little cars to the big cars sort of offset the cost of building the railroad. So most of them got converted over to standard gauge, which is the 56.5-inch. Now, the parks tend to use 3-foot gauge because it sort of fits in with the size of a park again. And if you look at the sketch on the screen, the real locomotives that they used for 3-foot gauge is on the right. Kings Island's in the middle, so ours were actually a little bigger than a full-size narrow gauge engine. On the left is Disneyland. Now, Disneyland was an odd one. Walt found a picture of an 1870s standard gauge engine that he really, really liked, but it was so big it wouldn't have fit into the park. So he says, let's just take that and scale it down to 5/8 size. Well, it just very conveniently and coincidentally came down to be a 3-foot gauge engine. So you can tell there that our trains are far, far bigger than the original Disneyland trains.
Yeah. And Cincinnati used to be known as the narrow gauge capital of the world.
We were for about 10 years, yeah. It was because we had 5 narrow gauge railroads here. 2 of them went out of business. The other 3 were converted to standard gauge. And we also had the National Narrow Gauge Convention here in town in the 1870s when the fad was at its height. And then a few years later, Colorado sort of took the title away from us when they started building narrow gauge all over the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah. Right, now you're talking about the Disney trains. So Disney used the simplified brakes, but you had full Westinghouse. So what made your system with the KI at Miami Valley Railroad the real fail-safe thing, and why is it harder to learn like smooth stops?
Okay, I think we're going to have to go into history a little bit here, so hang on. In the beginning, the trains were stopped by brakemen, not by the engineer. The engineer would whistle for brakes, and you had 3 or 4 guys sitting on top of the cars, which was not a safe thing to do. And they would get up, and in ice and snow and rain, it didn't matter. They'd go running down through the cars, and they would set the brakes on all the cars. And they had like a wheel on top that looked like a steering wheel called a brake wheel, where they'd crank them down and stop the trains. And I'm sure OSHA would love that today. You know, you might leave a station with 3 brakemen and get to the next station with 2 brakemen and say, where's Harry? Oh, he fell off over that trestle back there. They'll find him when the snow melts. So that was the way braking was done. And there were many people that tried to find a safer way to do that, a way that the engineer could control the brakes. And many tried, and George Westinghouse, who was the same guy that did all the electricity stuff and the like, he was trying it as well, and he was frustrated. And then one day he read an article about how they were drilling a tunnel over in Europe using compressed air. They were creating compressed air outside the tunnel and transporting it into the tunnel with hoses. He said, I think that's the answer. So he built a test train where you had a pipe running the whole length of the train, and when you hit the compressed air, it would push all the brake cylinders and stop the train. It worked great, but it had 2 flaws. Number one, if the train was uncoupled or derailed or something, the train would break in 2 and you had no brakes at all. And number 2, it only worked on short trains because it took a long time for that air to get to the back of the train, and you had the back cars crashing into the front cars. So Westinghouse said, well, that was a good start. Got to come up with something better. So he decided on a brake where if you took air off of it, it would set the brakes. And he did it by what they call a triple valve. Under each one of Kings Island's coaches, you have an air tank, a reservoir. So each car has its own air. And then you also have what they call a triple valve, which is a 3-way valve. It has a pipe going to the train line that's going down the length of the whole train. It has a pipe going to the reservoir, and then it has another pipe going to the brake cylinder. So what you're doing is when you're sitting in the station or when the train's moving, the air pump, which is the thing you hear panting on the engine when it's sitting in the station, it is pumping up the reservoirs on each of those cars. So all the cars are fully charged with air. Then when the engineer, say, bleeds 5 pounds of pressure off the train line, this little triple valve says, he must want brakes. So it shuts off the line to the train line to the reservoir and changes it to a line going from the reservoir to the brake cylinder, puts the brakes on. Now, that's sort of the simplified version. It's pretty complex because it proportions. If I drop 5 pounds on the train line, it might put 30 or 40 pounds to the brake cylinder. It's more to it than a simple valve, but that is the way that the rail trains work today. And that's what we have at Kings Island. Disney, on the other hand, has simplified theirs, and they just use the straight air, the first Westinghouse idea, where you just pump air into the line and set the brakes, which is not a problem at Disney because they never break up their cars and they have big safety chains between them, so they don't worry about the train breaking into and losing their brakes. Now, Kings Island has one other feature. We've got the triple valve Westinghouse on the 6 coaches of each train, but we also have a straight air, the first Westinghouse design, on the engine itself. Are you still with me? This is getting a little complex.
Oh yeah.
Right? We're following along.
Okay, so imagine if your automobile had one brake pedal to slow the car down and another brake pedal to stop the car. That's basically how we would run the train. We'd come down the hill and we'd use the triple valve on the coaches to slow it down. We'd come into the station, we'd still use it to slow the train down. And then when we got to the water tower, where we had to make a really precise stop, we would actually use the engine brake because it was a lot more accurate. When you're trying to take air off of the train line and use those triple valves, yeah, it'll stop you, and it'll stop you right now, but it's not always exactly where you want it to. So we actually use two different types of brakes on the Kings Island trains.
All right, let's talk about steam versus diesel. Kind of break that down.
Okay, money mainly. Steam engines spent 50% of their time in the roundhouse. They had to have their boilers washed. They had to have the pumps torn down. They had to have all these bearings fixed and all. So steam engines are incredibly inefficient. That's why we lost them from the real railroads. I think the most efficient steam engine they ever had, they figured, was about 8% thermally efficient. And the other 94% or other 92% of your heat went up the stack. Diesels are a closed system, closed cylinders, much, much cheaper to run. So there are parks that have decided steam's just not worth it, and they've converted their steamers over to diesels. They have a diesel pushing them around now, which is sad, but I understand why they're doing it.
Early March 1972, tell the story of your first day and the roasting frozen engine hose over the air compressor exhaust.
The first day at the park was not my most successful, and it was rather disappointing. We showed up that day, and keep in mind, the engine house had no doors on it. It was just a roof and 2 walls back then. We didn't have any place to keep the coaches. They sat out in the weather, and it was bitter cold that day with a driving wind. So we got in there. We fired the engines up. We were going to take them around a few times. You know, we were planning on doing about a 6-hour day, I think. And we got them hot, and we couldn't get any water to the engine. The hoses between the engine and tender, where the water goes to get into the boiler, those were solid with ice. And to fire up an engine, normally when a fire is going, your steam is creating a draft across the fire. But if you don't have steam, you got to use air. So we had an air compressor sitting outside the engine house. And it was one of those trailer-mounted gasoline ones. So my first job Lou gave me was to take those hoses off and go out and stand in this bitter blowing wind and just hold these hoses over the top of the exhaust of that air compressor like a real dork until they thawed out. So we got those thawed out. We put them back on the engines. We got the engines running. And keep in mind, it takes about 3 hours from cold to fire up one of those engines. Yeah, you can get them hot faster than that, but it puts a lot of stress on the boiler. So you don't want to abuse the boiler by heating them up too fast. So we finally got them going, and we went out. We took a few laps. That was my first day. I was learning the ropes. You know, he was teaching me how the injectors work. I knew how they worked, but each injector works a little bit differently. And we pulled into the station to get water. And we had the same problem. The water tower was frozen up or turned off. I don't know which. So Lou said, well, I guess we're done for today. Let's go around and back them in. So we went to pull them out. And of course, I was the green kid on the crew, and I was excited and wasn't thinking what I was doing. And I left the spout down. And so as we pulled out of the station, we ripped the spout right off the water tower, put a big gash in the front of the first coach. And I can remember Don Palmer and Bill Reed standing there looking at that poor spout hanging from the chain, wondering what it was going to cost to fix it. So I sort of went home a little bit dejected that first day. I didn't know if I was still on the crew or not. But however, a month or so later, I was vindicated because we pulled in one night and Kenny needed water. So I got up on the tender. We always pulled the spout down, you know, as it was passing the tender. And Kenny didn't stop. And we crashed into it again and took the spout right off. But this time there was pressure on it. And it was interesting watching the guests try to get out of that coach fast before the 3-inch stream of water hit them. And I said, Kenny, what the heck are you doing? And he said, well, at night, I always line it up on the shadow of that water softener shed. But tonight, I guess I was looking at the shadow of the engine cab, and it just kept going on with me.
What did you learn from this instance? Like that things are okay if somebody else does it worse?
I kind of like
my walk away.
I like that, and it's also a little bit ironic that when I'd gone to Disneyland a few years before, the guy pulled in and the spout came off in his hands and about washed him off the tenders. So it happens; those things happen. Lou actually derailed one of the engines one morning, so that made me feel a little bit better too. They had to get a crane out there and pick up the front of the engine and set it back on the track. We were a little late getting going that day.
All right, let's talk about opening day. So it's April 29th, 1972. You had a platform supervisor, a little bit of an attitude that day. He had a little bit of a reality check. Talk about that.
Yeah, he was the big honcho at Coney Island on the Coney Island and Lake Como. And down there, all the conductors would spend a few hours being a conductor on the station platform, and then they go run the engine for a few hours. He didn't understand that when we got to Kings Island, these weren't just little gasoline trains anymore. This is something that took a little more knowledge. So he didn't get to run the engine, and he wasn't too happy with that. So it was a cold, misty day. I mean, it was miserable out that day. And we only had 4,000 people in the park. Can you imagine Kings Island with 4,000 people in it today? I mean, you'd probably have to have binoculars to find everyone. So the Star Spangled Banner came over the PA system, and this guy that was a station platform guy, he said, well, I guess we're open. And I'm thinking, how can you not be excited about opening a big theme park, you know? So we got going that day, and we were running both trains the first day, even though there were only 4,000 people in the park. And we were losing money hand over fist by running both trains. We were sitting there after the Star Spangled Banner. I think we sat there close to an hour before the first of those 4,000 people made it back to Rivertown. Because let's face it, we were the end of the world. Except for the canoes, there was nothing behind us. We were the end of the world. So we finally got, I think it was 4 passengers. And everyone on the crew obviously wanted to be on the first run. So we had 6 employees and 4 passengers on that first run. That was not an economical way to run a railroad. And so we went through the mist, both trains running. And then about noon, Lou got hungry. So he backed his in. And Kenny's, grumbling because he didn't get to eat. But I was having fun. I didn't care. We just kept on running. And in a little while, Lou pulled back out and we backed into the engine house to eat lunch. We're sitting there eating lunch and this thunderstorm comes through and Lou's out there just getting drenched. So Kenny was happy with that. It was an interesting day to start.
So 4,000 people the first day, and it took an hour for the first riders to return. What was up with that?
Well, they used to keep the chains up, I guess. You could get into the park at 9 o'clock, but they kept the chains up and dropped them at 10. So that's when rides started. But there were so many things for people to see up front with the Eiffel Tower and Coney Island and Hanna-Barbera and the dark ride that they just didn't even wander back to Rivertown for almost the full hour. We opened at 10 on the rides, and it was probably 11 before they got back there.
I know they're probably still in awe of just International Street alone for the first hour.
Oh, absolutely.
So you mentioned this before, but construction delays made it so there was really nothing to see on the train route. And you narrated it with the PA system, which is kind of a funny tale to tell, but I don't know how Don and I would react if Kings Island did that today, honestly.
Yeah.
What did you do? Right. What, yeah, you're supposed to say everything's fine. See all the trees? So
on your left, you see a mud hole. On the right, you see a mud hole.
Well, what did you tell them? Were you like, you passed like, hey, this is where the Indian tribe is going to be? Like,
right.
What was your narration like?
Yeah, I don't remember what the narration on the platform was, but the animation they brought up from Coney, basically we crossed the trestle, and then there was an Indian burial ground on the left, and then which there's other stories about how we messed around with that. And then there were some teepees, and as we went up the hill, we had some deer and a bear, I think. And Ed McHale used to have this speech, don't get too close to those deer. They'll run like scared deer. Just stupid slapstick humor like that. And then we went past a beaver dam where the beaver cut down the tree, and they didn't have the timing right. So the tree would fall and then pop right back up again. And then we went around the loop, which was out where the water park is now. There's a mountain there that we used to circle. And the Indians would pop up from behind the trees and shoot at us. And about 10 o'clock one night, one of them, the propane rifle, wasn't working right. And the mannequin caught on fire, and he popped up. He was sort of self-cremated that night.
Oh, no.
And then we came around the loop, and we started heading back down the hill. And there was Trapper Charlie Flat's cabin, where Trapper Charlie Flat was sitting there on his front porch, and all of a sudden an arrow came out of his chest. And then we passed the cabins that are still there. There were 2 settlers' cabins that are still there. Those were the first things that were built. And originally it was just a mannequin stirring a pot there, and then the live actors took over those cabins. In fact, one of the reasons the live actors went away eventually, I'm told, after my time, they were using the cabins in ways that probably weren't quite friendly to parents, shall we say. So that probably caused the demise of the actors. So that's what they basically saw as they went around.
So got off to a little bit of a slow start, but then July 4th, the floodgates opened.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking about those cabins. I'll throw another one out real quick that was kind of fun. One day we're chugging up the hill, and the mannequins were out there. We had not seen them before. They had just put them up today, but this was during the weekend. So they put them up on Friday, and we opened on Saturday. We're chugging up the hill, and the mannequins were there, and someone had snuck in and painted details on the mannequins. So we started getting complaints from parents about that, right? So they sent one. He was a very mama's boy type ride supervisor out there with a big sheet and safety pins to put over these mannequins. And we're chugging up the hill, and we see him out there putting these things on. He hadn't put the pins in. He was holding the sheets around these mannequins. And we blew the whistle and waved to him, and he decided to wave back just as the wind came up. And the next thing we saw, this guy was standing there with these naked mannequins that had details painted on them. So that was probably the best entertainment we had that week.
Yeah. So, the park was designed for 30,000 people ish.
Yeah.
And then, as Don kind of mentioned in his previous question, after the 4th of July, the spigot turned on. I know Dennis Spiegel kind of told us the same thing.
About that.
From your perspective, how did operations cope with just an excess of people in the park when it wasn't designed?
Basically, people had to wait in lines. You got to keep in mind that back then we were a major ride. Today they only run it 6 hours a day because you got so many coasters and everything. But back then it was the train, the racer, the Eiffel Tower, the Sky Ride, the Dark Ride, the Log Flume, and probably the antique cars. So there were about 7 major rides, and we were one of them. And that July 4th weekend, it was a Saturday, I remember. And I was firing for Lou, and we're chugging up the hill, and I look out beyond those 3 houses on Columbia Road there, and I saw cars parked out in the field. I said, "What's going on out there? They've never done that before." And as we came back around the loop, I could see the parking lot all the way down to the main gate, and it was packed out. And I said, "Lou, I think we're in for an interesting day today." We ran both trains solid that day, well into the evening. it was a Saturday, so we closed at 11 o'clock. And by that time, we were tired enough. We were looking forward to it. And about a quarter to 11, there was a PA announcement that said, due to the fact that the crowd is not dissipated, we are staying open till midnight tonight. And we're sort of going, oh, that's good, I guess. And so we're still running the train to midnight. And quarter to midnight, there was another announcement. We're staying open till 1 a.m. So that was the longest we ever ran the park, was still 1 a.m. on July 4th weekend. And the crowds never stopped after that. With both trains running that day, we had the bullpen and the station full, and we also had a crowd that was literally lined up all the way across the street in Rivertown. It was impressive. And I think the people downtown stopped worrying about their finances when that happened.
Good.
Yeah, that's the way Dennis usually tells it too. Let's talk about the schedule that you had back then. It was like a 4-day schedule, 8 hours on, 16 on, 8 on, then a day off. You were making about a $1.35 an hour. So talk about that grind and what it taught you.
Well, there were some long, hot days. I never understood why they did it that way, but it was left over from Coney Island. Your first day would be an 8-hour day. You'd either work, I think the first day you worked from opening till dinner. And then the second day you worked from opening to closing. The third day you worked from lunch to closing. I believe it was 8:16, then you had a day off. And it was hot in that cab. The cab would get up to 120, 130 degrees at times. I used to go through a full milkshake glass of crushed ice every time I went around that track. It got hot and long for a while, but I was having so much fun, I really didn't care. I always got there early the next day.
Yeah. So you once got fired for 16 hours and rehired the next day.
Yeah.
That's considered a win. What did that teach you about like workplace politics and stuff? Tell us that.
I was a dumb young kid at that time. I was 21, but it was only the second job I'd ever had. And Don Palmer, who was head of ops that year, he was a very good guy at what he did, but he was not always easy to get along with. And I used to grumble about that a lot. And it made it back to him that I was doing it. So one day I'm in the engine house minding my own business, polishing brass, and I see Don and Bill Reed coming down the track. What are they coming back here for? And they came back to the engine house and said, you come with us. And they walked me out of the park. And it's like, oh, crap. I mean, this was my dream job. This is what I've always wanted to do, and I just blew it. And so I went home, and my parents weren't home at the time. I was living with them in the summers on college. And I'm sitting there about 5 o'clock trying to figure out how am I going to explain that to them. And the phone rings, and it was Don. And he says, be in my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I said, you just fired me. Why should I come in? He said, be in my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So when I got there, I went in Don's office, and there was Lou sitting across the desk. And Don basically said, Lou has sort of begged me to bring you back. You think you can keep your mouth shut? And I said, yeah, I can do that. I'll definitely do that. So I was back on the payroll the next day. That taught me a lesson.
Yeah. But so, and then speaking of people with authority, Al Weber, he toured the park in 71 in the yellow VW Beetle. What did the site look like when he came through?
Well, as I said, Bill Reed had invited me down to interview in December 71, I guess it was, 6 months before the park opened. And I interviewed with Don and Bill, and that went quite well. Lou was not involved at that time. And then they said, well, you probably want to go back and see the train. I said, yeah, I want to go see the train. Because, I was still thinking Coney Island until all of a sudden Dayton Daily News put a picture of the engine in, and I was now getting excited because I saw how big that thing was. So they called in this young kid, this young blonde whippersnapper that was probably in his late 20s, by the name of Al Weber. This young whippersnapper eventually became the general manager of the park and the head of Paramount Parks, but at that time he was just a young kid. We had a bright yellow VW Beetle, and we just toured the park. He took me out through Oktoberfest and Coney and showed me everything, and then we went over to the station. The station was full of canoes because they just hauled them up from Coney and put them in the station to have a place to put them. Went out and looked at the trestle, walked out there, which they had, not completed it yet. They had a walkway on one side, but it was on the wrong side. It wouldn't have helped us a bit. And then Al says, well, you want to go see the locomotive? We got back in the VW. We drove through Hanna-Barbera and maintenance and went back to the engine house. And quite honestly, the engine was a wreck at that time. They had apparently fired it up on Little Miami River water or something. It was covered with mud. Yeah. But I didn't care. I was excited, and I crawled all over the thing and told Al what everything was for. This is the air pump. This is the independent brake. This is the automatic brake. So I think Al got impressed a little bit that day. And that's sort of how I got the job, at least for a little while, until I called back a month later and they said they were going to only use older guys. And I said, no, I want this job.
All right. You once challenged the racer to a ridership race, the train versus the racer for ridership. You almost won. How did that happen? And what did it say about the train's popularity back in those days?
Well, we were just being ornery. I mean, we were entertaining ourselves. Ed McHale, the park manager, he had an attitude that if we had fun, then the guests would have fun. And so we had a lot of fun. And one day we had a couple extra conductors that we didn't need. So we said, let's have a race with the racer. And we sent him over to Coney and had him actually stand in the front of the entrance of the racer and say, when you get done riding here, come over to the train. And eventually the racer people caught on to that, and they were doing the same thing. And I think it was up until about the last half hour that night, we were actually beating the racer for ridership that day. And, of course, at the end of the day, everyone wanted to go to the racer, so we lost at the last minute. But that was one of the fun things to do. We had a lot of pride in the ride at that time.
Yeah. Now, opening day, you had a ride with the media. You got to ride the tender with WKRC. Talk about that.
I don't remember much about except Luke came to me and said, those guys are going to ride on the back of that tender with their camera, and I don't want them falling off. You get up there and stay with them. And there's a picture somewhere of that. The picture was actually out on the internet, and I never knew it was taken. And probably about 10 years ago, I was just sort of scanning through pictures on the internet, and I looked at that and I said, that's me. Now, whether the guy on the left was Nick Clooney or not, I do not know, because I don't know what Nick looked like back then. It might be, it might not, but it's possible. And anyway, they were filming on the very first day we ran, and there's a picture out there of me with the television crew sitting on the back of the engine.
So you mentioned that they had the live actors and they had the Indians and all that stuff, and a lot of that wouldn't be acceptable in today's world, but can you talk about some of your standout memories of when the train did have live actors, things like Running Bear and Madame Butterfly and things of that
Running Bear, this one kid that was an Indian, he wore a skin tight, skin colored bathing suit with just a loincloth over it. That's why he called himself Running Bear, B-A-R-E, not B-E-A-R. And they took lipstick and put stupid jokes on his back, and they did a lot of that kind of stuff. One of them that stands out to me as a man, two of the bandits that used to hold us up right before we got into the station were Judy and Jody. And they wore red satin miniskirts and fishnet stockings, and they carried whips. And I'm thinking, yeah, Kings Island wants something for everyone, but that may be taking it a little too far. And they used to love to stand right next to the track. And I used to be sucking on that ice out of that milkshake glass all day long. So I figured out I could put the milkshake glass on the windowsill and just accidentally drop it when I got to Jody and Judy. That made it a lot of fun. And then we had Denny Spiegel, and everyone knows about Denny Spiegel who knows anything about Kings Island. He decided to get into the act. He would dress up the office staff up front as the bandits and come out and relieve the actors once in a while. And one day I got wind of the fact that Denny was going to route the train. So we stopped out by the fort, which was way out of earshot of Denny. And I crawled back over the tender and got on the PA system and told the passengers what was going on. And so we had all the passengers, about 400 passengers in on this. And when we got to the bandit scene, Denny comes running out, stop the train, stop the train, stop the train. And 400 passengers stood up and said, hi, Mr. Spiegel. And we went right on by. And it was like 20 years later, I saw Denny at a Chamber of Commerce meeting somewhere. And I said, Denny, did you ever figure out who did that? And he says, yeah, I sort of remember about that. I don't think I ever knew who did it. I said, you're looking at him. So we had a lot of fun with the actors.
That's fun. So how did your fireman, Matt, end up shooting the Indians with a grease gun? And what was the day the actors did a rollback with you? Tell us that. Tell us about that. Paint this picture.
The same kid, Mark, the running bear, he decided, he was getting tired of chasing the coaches themselves. We had this one girl that would, hold her eyes every time she'd shoot at the Indians. And he thought, well, let's just have some fun, run up beside the engine and chase them for a while. And Matt, my fireman, got the grease gun out and just shot the guy right in the face with grease. And so Running Bear never bothered us again after that. And we also had a little problem that the people that built the track, it was a professional track laying company that did it, but probably the specifications that the architect made didn't specify that you had to put some slop in the track for expansion and, for the fact that you're going around really tight curves, because they put in 150-foot radius curves, which was the absolute minimum that Crown recommended. So we were grinding little pieces of steel off the insides of the rails as we were going around those curves. And they hired a kid to come out there and grease the insides of the rails and never bothered to tell him to not put it on the top. So we were slipping and sliding all over the place. And I think I was probably pretty lucky that I only didn't make the hill once. And today, I guess they have a lot of rollbacks out there where they have to stop and back it up. But I was lucky I only did it once. But the one time I did it, we were chugging up the hill and the Indians were coming out of the woods and they saw the train stop and they're sort of like, what's going on? And they saw me starting to back up. So they just decided, we're going to back up with him. And they backed right into the woods as if the whole thing was rehearsed. It came out beautifully.
That's funny. And so many people don't know about the hill because it's such a small grade, but for a train, it's a big deal. I was, me and my friends were talking about getting, rolling back on the hill every once in a while, especially during Winterfest, it happens. Mm-hmm. And my friend Katie was with us. She's like, what is this hill you're talking about? Mm-hmm. So will you describe, well, I mean, maybe it's in different standards now, but it runs along the service road that's there now. Like right. Obviously, like Landmark said, you remember along the hill are no longer there, but mm-hmm. It's like just a few degrees grade that is mm-hmm. uphill, but that might as well be a mountain for a train in some regards.
Well, it's a little over 1%, which is not a huge amount. Six Flags St. Louis has the very same type trains, and they've got 4%.
Oh, wow.
But we have a situation where when you go behind the coach shed, there's that tight curve to the right there, which used to be the Indian Burial Grounds. And so you couldn't get a run for it, or you didn't want to get a run for it because it was very hard on the track if you did. My way of doing it was to coast into that curve. And as soon as you feel the engine jog over in the curve, then I pour the steam to it. But you don't really get a run for the hill. And they have improved it a lot. There used to be an S curve in that hill they've taken out. But I understand that when they relayed the track in 1989 for the water park, they wanted the station to be dead level for obvious reasons. You don't want to roll out of the station. And to do that, they had to put a little hump right there at the end, right in that left-hand curve before you go to the water park. And I think that's probably more than 1% at that point.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the train derailed. Mm-hmm. I want to hear that story.
Well, it was a really spectacular derailment. We were moving about 3 miles an hour and it derailed one axle. But what happened was, first of all, you have to understand who I was working with. Riverboat Captain Bob Adams, who was just a trip to work with. But one night, it was probably 9 o'clock or so, I guess. I was on break. Bob was running the engine. Back then, we actually ran with one person in the cab for quite a lot of the time. I was up there by myself many times. And then, sadly, we had an engineer that died on the cow catcher before the park opened one day. And they said, maybe we better not do that anymore. But anyway, Bob was running. I caught the tail of the train and I rode around. And where the horseshoe curve was, which today is that short left curve going into the water park, that was a ravine through there, went all the way up to Columbia Road. And they filled that. It was soft dirt that had settled. So the track was settling and the inside rail had lowered a bit. And when Bob went across it, to put it in his nautical terms, the engine listed to port, and then it's straightened back up. So we get into the station, and I say, Bob, I think we need to call Don's office and ask for a shutdown. He says, yeah, I think you're right, but I'll tell you what. Why don't you run it this time, and I'll get on the back end and watch it? So, naturally, who did it happen to? It happened to me. And I took it a little too slowly, and it lifted the tender off the track and just dropped an axle on the ground. So it was no big deal. The only problem was number 19 was sitting over in the shed, and it was cold, and it would have taken 3 hours to fire it up. So we couldn't take the passengers back on that one, and we had to walk everyone back to the station in the dark, pitch dark. Because keep in mind, there were no lights out there at all, not in the parking lot even. And the grading stakes were still between the rails, so they were carrying their kids on their shoulders and tripping over grading stakes. They weren't happy. So meanwhile, we call maintenance, and maintenance cut up some oak wedges, which is you set them on the inside of the rail, and the wheel supposedly climbs up on there. And I tried it, and I couldn't get it to climb up on there. So I thought, well, maybe the cars are holding us up. I'll kick the cars off and let them roll down the hill a little bit. And we'd already talked about, how the Westinghouse brake works, and if you release the air, it stops the train. So I put Al Weber on the back of the back coach, and I said, Al, be very careful opening this valve, because if you hit it too fast, it's going to stop real fast. So we kicked the cars off, and they rolled back down the hill maybe 20 feet or so, and I blew the whistle, and Al opened the valve, and next thing I hear is bang, 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 and I'm thinking, I wonder if Al is still on the train. He's probably tangled up in the rear railing somehow. And he was my boss, of course. So we tried to get it back to go up on the wedges, and it still wouldn't do it. And Bob smoked big cigars, and we got under the tender to look at it. And Bob said, you want one of these cigars? And I said, there's 500 gallons of propane over our heads. I don't want a cigar. So we finally got it back on. What happened was that when it went on the ground, I did what I was supposed to do. I wound up the tender brake on it, and I forgot to take it back off. So I was trying to get it up on the rails with the brakes on it. But we got out of the park about 1 a.m. that morning. That was a long night putting that thing back on the track.
Yeah, I can imagine. My first train ride was at Coney Island.
Yep.
And park closed in 1971. But those Coney trains, they're still around today, one in Texas and one in Georgia. Talk about that.
Well, I think number 34 was Anthony Wayne, the light blue one. After the park closed, they kept them for a fair amount of time. I went down and talked to Gary Walks one day and asked him what they were going to do with them. And then they finally sold them, and the 34 went to World of Golf in Florence, Kentucky. And the guy there was going to run it down the hill, across the trestle, up along the lake, across the dam. They had the old Coney station on the dam, through a tunnel, and then come back. And he had this great idea that he was going to have a golf cart or a go-kart track back there, and he was going to haul kids back there. He was going to figure out a way to shoot buffalo from the train with lasers. He was going to gut one of the cars and make it into a bar car for golfers. And that lasted about 3 weeks, and the Florence sewage treatment plant overflowed into his lake. And I think that was the last time that train ever ran at World of Golf. So it eventually was stored for many years and got sold to Texas, to a little place called Oil Ranch. The other one went to Guntown Mountain at Mammoth Cave. It just went around a mountain in a small park there until the insurance got to be too much. They sold it to Big Bend Park in Bowling Green, and then Bowling Green never used it. They had it in storage and eventually sold it to this Lake Winnipesaukee down near Chattanooga. So they still run. I think both of them are now backup engines, because those were some of the first that Chance Manufacturing built, and they're the old technology. So I think that both of those parks have other engines that they use most of the time, and the Coneys are backups.
Yeah, it's funny. I know I don't ever remember at World of Golf or World of Sports, as it was known when, back, I think it's back to World of Golf now in Florence. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that train trestle and always wondering about that when I was little. I think it's gone now.
It's gone. They took it out. And keep in mind, that was about a 4% grade going down to that lake, and it was a curved trestle that was pretty high. First time we took it down there, I wasn't too sure we were going to make it across.
Yeah, but that's funny that I had no idea that was for the old Coney Island train. So that's very interesting. Well, you mentioned that a lot of places convert to diesel and it saves an operating cost, and there are kind of headaches involved with even propane, like Kings Island has. So when somebody asks like why not use steam everywhere, specifically at theme parks, like what would be your honest critique?
It comes down to money. It comes down to money. Like I said, it takes 3 hours to fire one up from coal. So you're paying someone to be there for a couple hours before the park and an hour afterwards. The maintenance on steam engines is quite significant. Over the years, the boilers deteriorate, and you have to either replace the boiler like Worlds of Fun did a couple of years ago, or at least get someone who's a very qualified pressure vessel welder to work on them. There's just a lot that's involved with steam engines. Coal is the cheapest you can use, and I'm sure that's why Cedar Point does it. And then probably oil, and then propane. But of course, propane keeps the park clean, so that's a great choice.
Winterfest, it lets guests get a little closer to the locomotives.
I was surprised when I saw that.
Yeah, pretty special opportunity there. Talk about that.
I was just impressed. I hadn't been to Winterfest for quite a few years, and I went there this year, and wow, you can walk right beside the engine. I love this. In fact, I talked to the crew for quite a bit, and I'm thinking, for years, I've always wanted them to put something there where guests could sit there and just look at the engine and talk to the crew. So that gave me the inspiration that maybe that's possible. I thought maybe that was one of those things they'd say absolutely no to. But I went home and drew it up. I think you've got a drawing of it there I made somewhere. So maybe we can see if we can encourage them to do that so that grandfathers can take their, no, that's my cartoon of Kenny there.
That's your cartoon. I was wondering what that was.
But yeah, I always thought that because of safety, because of the propane and the fact that the engines do shoot steam out the sides, that they would never want anything there. Because I remember Opryland, you could walk right up to the engines. They had a beautiful spot to do that. And Cedar Point still does. So I would love to see Kings Island do something like that.
Yeah. So speaking of nostalgic things when it comes to the train, what's one thing from like the 1972-ish era that if you could bring back one thing from the train, what would it be?
The one thing I'd love to bring back they will never do. Lou had no problems with us giving cab rides to people if they felt they knew something about a train and they seemed like a safe person. And I rode many, many people on that train in those first few years. We had one guy that he and his son came up. The father was in a wheelchair. And the son said, my dad always wanted to be a railroad engineer, but it was the Depression and there were no jobs and he never got the chance to do it. And Dad's sitting there in the wheelchair just looking at the engine, drooling on it. And I said, do you think two of us could get him up in the cab? And we picked him up and put him in the cab. And he finally got to ride on an engine after all those years. And I'll never forget that experience. And then there was another experience I'll also never forget. A lady came up and she told me it was an electric train. And those bottles in the tender were just to make smoke. They weren't heating anything, right? And I could not convince her that it was not an electric train. And so finally I took her to the back of the tender and opened up the toolbox on the back and showed her the two 12-volt batteries that ran the sound system. And she went away happy that that was an electric train. Those two little batteries were pulling all those people.
Yeah, that would be a good, great opportunity, for guests if they were able to do that again. But for anyone that wants to go deeper, books, clubs, museums, places to see, live steam, where should they start?
Unfortunately, we don't have any great railroad museums around here. I would say the closest ones are either in central Pennsylvania, the East Broad Top, or the Strasburg. The Strasburg is wonderful. It's the State Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. Wonderful restorations. Chattanooga, Tennessee Valley is a beautiful museum. If you want to get into the small stuff, the size that I have, I would go to discoverlivesteam.com. It's all one word, discoverlivesteam.com. And they tell stories. They tell you a little bit about the technology. They have lists of all the clubs around the country. They have a for sales section where people are selling their own trains off, and other people are going, oh my God, I can never afford one of those. But they're not cheap. Unless you build your own, they're not cheap.
Yeah, discoverlivesteam.com. Well, Dennis, it's been a real honor having you on the show. This has been absolutely fascinating. So we really appreciate it. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, let's do that. It's been a lot of fun. It's brought back some wonderful memories for me.
Awesome.
And if you're at Kings Island one day this summer, and I'm there, let's both enjoy a ride on the train.
Absolutely. Yep. And it'll probably be the green one, right?
Well, hopefully. I like the green 19.
You always wear 19, yeah.
Of course. We'll be right back with the listener questions. All right, first listener question is a voicemail. Let's check it out.
This is David from Lebanon. I heard a rumor Tower Topics is going to be shut down. Is the rumor true? What would be sad if the rumor is true? You do good work, so I hope the rumor isn't true. I've learned so much about Kings Island from this show. From David. Thank you.
Okay, so David's question from Lebanon, Ohio is Tower Topics getting shut down?
Well, first, I'd like to, glad that David has learned a lot about Kings Island from the show. We've had a lot of people tell us that, but, is the rumor true? Absolutely not. Tower Topics will continue as long as Ryan and I would like to do it.
Yep, and we have no indication of not liking to do it. I would say that it will outlast some employees that are underperforming at Kings Island. Just saying.
I think so too.
But so no, Tower Topics is not going anywhere. That's not the plan. No one's threatened it or anything like that yet. But nope, Tower Topics is good. Tower Topics is here to stay. It'll survive the apocalypse like roaches. All right. Jeremy from Loveland said, gentlemen, legendary Marvel artist, hopefully I don't butcher this name, Sal Buscema, one of the last living creators from the Marvel Age of Comics in the 60s, has passed away at the age of 89. How would you describe his work?
I think that just happened in the last few days or whatever, with him passing. How would you describe his work? When you look at artists like that, I think the best way to describe them is that they're drawings. They don't need any words to tell the story.
Good cover, Don. I don't see you as a comic book guy. I will say this.
I'm not a comic book guy, but I would say though, when you talk about great artists and that, and people that are known for that, their work, their drawings, words aren't needed to tell a story. So I would think that applies here.
And I think that's true with comic books. Like, I've never really been into comic books myself, but I will say that in the 60s, they were far more relevant than they are today because they didn't have all this great television that they have now. But it's sad that it seems more and more artists from that age, Stan Lee and people like that, are passing away. So God rest his soul. But yeah, it's hard to describe his work. I'm familiar with Marvel Comics from the 60s, but I don't know him from Adam, to be honest with you.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't tell who drew what, for me, I'm familiar with the Marvel, that age of the comics, but in terms of the individual name and who's associated with what, I couldn't tell you that, other than just that, when you talk about those kind of artists and that, it's just normally that, they just could paint pictures that told stories, or draw pictures that told stories.
So Jeremy from Loveland, he had the second part of his question. He said, Kings Island related, can we expect the monster spinning again at Coney Mall this year? I
think so. There's no reason to think why not. They could have ran it last year, the parts that they needed that they were in. But it's just, one time I think they put out on their website and on social media that it would return in July. And it did not. The parts were there net. So for whatever reason, they just chose not to put it back together last year. But yeah, I think when the park opens in April, you'll see the monster spinning again. And I think that's awesome because, it's not the biggest, tallest, fastest, anything like that. But it's Coney Mall, it's Kings Island. When you think of the Coney Mall vibe, it's rides like that, the Scrambler, to dodge them. You need those kind of rides. So I'm excited to see it back, and I hope that guests understand, because it wasn't operating last year, that guests do vote with their feet, so make sure that you ride it when you visit the park.
Yeah, and this was a Kings Island original, moved over from Coney Island, so there is a history involved in it. For me, I've only ridden the Monster like 2 or 3 times in my life, but there are a lot of people, especially little kids, that absolutely love that ride. They're willing to look past the fact that it takes half your day just to load the dang thing. But
I would ride it. I rode it a lot in the 70s and the 80s. Back then, it was a lot of fun. And as you get older, sometimes it's a little harder to ride those kind of rides, like the Scrambler and the Monster. But no, but it's just such a part of the fabric of Kings Island and the Coney Mall sector that I'd hate to see it go.
Yeah. And if you've got your own questions, you can send them to us via email at hosts@towertopics.com, HOSTS@towertopics.com. Your first name, the city you're from, as well as your question, your buy or sell. We'd love to hear from you. You don't want to do that? You can send us a text or a voicemail to 513-399-7538. That's 513-399-7538. If you send us a text, we may read it. If you send us a voicemail, we may play it on the air just like we did today. Either way, send it on in. I'm Ryan. That's Don. Let's keep this train a chugging. This is Tower Topics.